So I'm delighted to be joined by one of our panelists who is set to speak at Reuters Events Payment Summit Europe in London this June. With over 2 decades at the Bank of England, Will has extensive experience within emerging technology that impacts the payments and fintech ecosystem. Thank you very much for joining us today, Will. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, and it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So are you able to briefly introduce yourself, your current role at the Bank of England?
Sure. So my name is Will Lovell, and I am the Head of Future Technology at the Bank of England, which is a slightly daunting title. The original idea was to be looking at technologies that were over the horizon, if you like, of the current projects that we're working on. But in practice, the change in payments and the innovation in digital currency fills almost all of my time, if not all of my time. So I spend most of my time focusing on that.
Great. And what are some of the challenges you see in the payments landscape in 2022, the top 3? And what are some of the solutions which are leading the way to help overcome these challenges?
So I think in some ways, one of the biggest challenges is knowing where to focus. There is so much innovation going on, but also in so many different problem spaces. So if you like, a challenge both for, I think, fintechs and payment service providers and banks is to decide which part of the problem they want to tackle first. And that's obviously going to depend partly upon their business model and where they seek the revenues, but also where the most innovation is happening. So I think the first thing is to choose focus, whether that might be particularly in digital currency, or whether that might be in cross-border payments, or whether that might be in looking at different business models. So that would be my, I think, first challenge. I think the second one is cross-border. Now, the reason that I picked that out as a challenge is I think there are just so many aspects to it. I think it's a common misconception that cross-border payments are somehow like email systems, and you can just plug them all together and boom, it'll all just start working. And it's much more complicated than that. But there is a lot of work going on in that space, and within the Bank of England, we're involved within the G7, actually trying to coordinate internationally so we can look at things like data standards, so that information can be exchanged in a much more seamless fashion, so that payments can go through in a much more seamless fashion. Third one I would choose is actual innovation in business models. Now, what I mean by that is, in many cases, business models are driven by the way that people can pay for things. So, for example, a subscription model lends itself quite nicely to paying monthly, and the payment system lends itself to that as well. But if we start to look at business models where micropayments, maybe fractions of a penny or fractions of a cent, can be made, suddenly there are ways to devise business models that currently aren't really possible. And I think we'll see a drive from product development in the first place of people wanting to innovate those kinds of business models, but also on the payment side, something to facilitate that. So yeah, I think that could be a very interesting and very challenging area as well.
What are some of those examples on that third point there?
So I'm thinking particularly about online business. So for example, maybe a pay-per-click or pay-per-page magazine subscriptions, things like that, but also Internet of Things type of scenarios where you've got perhaps vehicles or people, the movement of goods, and very, very small payments can be made rather than having to commit and subscribe up in advance. And we're starting to see some of this stuff come through, but actually, as those products, the complexity and those products start to be developed, and also the payment solutions start to be developed, we could see some real change and some real innovation going on in that space.
Fascinating. Thanks for sharing. And what do you predict is the most disruptive thing facing payments industry in the next 5 years? And how can the industry best prepare?
That's a hard question. I mean, the biggest thing we're working on within the Bank of England, aside from the renewal of RTGS, is the development of a central bank digital currency. Now, I have to emphasize at this point, we haven't taken the definite decision to go ahead with that. And that's because we really need to understand what the use cases for it are and make sure we get the design right. You know, this is not something that we can move fast and break things. This is somewhere where we have to exercise a bit more caution to make sure we get it right. But that has the potential to make enormous change, I think, across the industry.
Great. And we're very excited to have you speaking on our day 2 panel at the Reuters Events Payment Summit Europe. Could you just give some insight into some of the things you hope to discuss at the summit?
I normally find myself talking about central bank digital currency because it's such a focus area and such an interest area. I think people in some sectors just want to understand what it is and how it differs from things like Bitcoin. People are interested in how we're thinking about some of the big design challenges, particularly around things like financial inclusion or around data use and privacy, things like that. And then people from much more the industry end are just almost, when can we get our hands on this and start working with it? So yeah, it tends to drive a lot of questions from a lot of different sectors.
Great. Thank you very much for your insights. It's been great chatting to you, and we look forward to seeing you in June in person.
I look forward to being there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Will.